Hello, everyone, and welcome to Movie Goodness, where we examine life through cinema here on the KB Radio Network. I am your host, Kevin Reed, and this is a very exciting episode, at least for me. This is an episode that has been 4 years in the making. Uh, 4 years because this show has existed for 4 years, and of course, I love to talk about film. I love to talk about films that I'm excited about, that I love, that I just adore, that I put on the upper echelons. Every now and then, we'll discuss films that weren't so high on my list, but it kind of fits the topic that we're talking about. But I've been waiting. I've shown great restraint from talking about these particular films, and we're only talking about one, but Batman in particular, because if anybody has been around me for at least 5 minutes at any point of their life, you know that I am the greatest Batman fan on earth. I love that character. That is my favorite superhero of all times. I love Bruce Wayne. I love Batman. I love the lore. I love his rogues gallery. I love the vast majority of those Batman films, live action or animated. It doesn't matter. I love Batman. Now, do I consider Batman the greatest superhero of all time? No, he's not the greatest, but he's just one I connect with. And the funny part about it is, as I get older, I connect more with Joker than I do with Bruce Wayne Batman. But that's besides the point. That's my mental health coming into play there. But overall, I absolutely love Batman. What makes Batman my favorite character is the mere fact that he stands toe to toe or alongside some of the greatest superheroes of all time. He stands side by side with gods, man. Superman being one. The Superman is the most powerful being in the universe, and he stands toe to toe with Superman and doesn't care. He stands toe to toe with Wonder Woman, who is literally a god, and don't care. The Flash and the rest of the Justice League, Martian Manhunter, and so on and so forth. And he's just a normal guy. I say normal. He's more of the peak of human ability. He doesn't have super strength, but he's the strongest human being on earth because he pushed himself to be that strong. He knows multiple forms of martial arts because he trained himself. He is super intelligent. The dude is just a phenomenal human being. But as far as being a metahuman or a superpowered individual, or he fell into a vat of toxic waste and he developed these powers, or was struck by a comet, no, none of that. He's just a guy with billions of dollars and the time to play, the time to play with y'all. And so that's why I absolutely love Batman. His attitude, his confidence is top notch. And we had gotten to a point in cinema history when it comes to comic book films and comic book adaptations of this character, where the character had became laughable. We started off on a good foot in 1989 with Batman, that starred Michael Keaton, that was directed by Tim Burton. Phenomenal film. Is it flaws in that movie? Yes. Does it hold up well in 2025? There are portions of that film that's kind of dated, but it's still an enjoyable film, and it still played homage to that character perfectly, I felt. And Michael Keaton still stands as one of, if not the best, Bruce Wayne Batman portrayal in live action to this day. And it continued on in Batman Returns, and I thought that was, pretty good around the time that it came out. But once again, as I got older, I realized that movie is actually the better of the two Tim Burton Batman films with Michael Keaton. I thought that film was really good, really, really good, and it holds up a little better than Batman holds up. I actually enjoy Batman Returns a lot more, and I enjoyed it back then when it came out. I ran to the theater opening night. Me and my cousin, we went to go see it that night, that Friday night when it premiered. Then we started drifting into this weird territory. Now, mind you, around in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, comic book films weren't what we know today. MCUs and the DC films and stuff like that. There wasn't a lot of love and attention given to these comic book films. So when we did get, and they weren't back to back. We didn't get 3 comic book movies in a year. We weren't blessed like that, and have 2 Disney Plus shows and shows coming out on Max from the DC universe and stuff like that. We are just to the point now where people are questioning, are we oversaturated with comic book adaptations? But back in the 90s, it was few and far between. And so we took what we can get. So after we got Batman Returns, Tim Burton left, Michael Keaton left, and Joel Schumacher came in, God rest his soul. He a very good director, a very good filmmaker. If you don't believe me, just go back through his filmography. Don't let his legacy be those 2 Batman films that he directed, because the man did more than that. He directed The Lost Boys. He directed, if I'm not mistaken, Car Wash, and I could be off on that, but I think he did. But he's directed some really good Flatliners and St. Elmo's Fire, I believe. He directed some really good films in his time. Even after the Batman films, he did Falling Down with Michael Douglas, which is phenomenal. Especially now, and I know this is the saying for today, but as I've gotten older and I watch Falling Down, and I can relate to that character so much, so much. But the dude is phenomenal. So he takes over this Batman franchise at Warner Brothers, and he does Batman Forever. Batman Forever is a clear departure from the first 2 Batman films with Michael Keaton. This time, they cast the late great Val Kilmer in the role of Bruce Wayne, and I would argue, he did a good job. I know a lot of people hated Val Kilmer's portrayal of Bruce Wayne in Batman, and I understand that. And I'm not saying this. You can go back. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this on shows in the past, this before he passed away. And so I'm not doing the recency bias thing. When somebody dies and you speak fondly of him, I was speaking fondly of him before he passed away. So this isn't that. I actually enjoyed Val Kilmer's performance. The problem I had with Val Kilmer's performance, there was no difference between Bruce Wayne and Batman. He was the same. His voice, his looks, the way he walked, he was Batman when he was in Bruce Wayne's suit. He was the same person. There's no difference. Michael Keaton, there was a difference. Christian Bale, there was a difference. There was a difference with these characters because they're 2 different people. Batman is crazy. In case you don't know, the dude is insane. You have to be insane to dress up as a bat and run around Gotham City fighting these insane individuals that he has to fight. But that's the problem I had with it. But besides that, the movie got really colorful, with the neon colors, and I don't know what the direction there, but they were connected to the other films. At least they were trying to connect them. And we got introduced to Robin, who looked like he was about 30 in this film. And it was what it was. It wasn't the greatest thing, but it's a far cry from what we got next with Batman and Robin. Arguably the worst comic book movie ever made And yes, I'm thinking of the Fantastic Four with Miles Teller and Michael B. Jordan. Yes, I have that in consideration, but it's a tight race between those two films as the worst comic book movie of all time. It depends on what day you catch me on. I may say Fantastic Four. If you catch me tomorrow, I may say Batman and Robin. It depends. It depends on what mood I'm in. But you can rest assured that those are the bottom two. And since we're talking Batman, yes, Batman and Robin is so bad. I have yet, since I watched that movie in 1997, I have yet to sit down and watch that movie again from start to finish in one sitting since that movie's release. It's that bad. And I am the biggest Batman fan of all time. I cannot watch that movie. George Clooney was criminally miscast, and they had the audacity to bring him back in the Flash. And they did it at the end of the movie like that was going to be a shock cameo that everybody was going to be talking about. The movie was bad as it is, but then you bring that on just to put the icing on top of the cake. And whatever. But that was the worst of all of the Batman. God bless him, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Dr. Freeze. Arnold Schwarzenegger was the only one who knew what movie he was in. He knew it was a silly, stupid movie, and he gave a silly, stupid performance. Not hating on Arnold Schwarzenegger. I really ain't. And even though it was a bad performance, it wasn't him. It was the movie. He fit the movie. The movie was just bad. It was just all around bad. But anywho's, it was so bad that it just killed all production of Batman film. Pretty much killed all productions of comic book movies up to that point. We didn't get anything. We didn't get nothing for about 3 years because it was that bad of a movie. And it was even longer for a Batman film. That is until 20 years ago this year. It, to put it more accurately, time of this recording, today marks the 20th anniversary of Batman Begins, the release on June the 15th, 2005, a day that will live in infamy. Reason being, I believe that this film, Batman Begins, pretty much started or laid the template for a lot of foundational comic book films to come on after that. You know, I don't think we get the MCU without Batman Begins. We don't get the Man of Steel without Batman Begins, you know, and so on and so forth. Because you think back in 2008 when Iron Man came out, Iron Man was kind of grounded and serious to a degree. You know, it still had its Marvel flair, but it was taken seriously. And Batman Begins is the first comic book movie to come out that really took itself seriously. Now, you can make an argument for Blade. Blade did take itself seriously. You know, that first Blade was very, very serious. Very serious. But the reason I say Batman, because of the mainstream appeal. Everybody knew who Batman is and was. But nobody knew Blade was a comic book movie. You know, until after the fact, I think. I don't think a lot of people were hip to the knowledge that Blade was a Marvel character. But, you know, if you're not in the know. But it is definitely a Marvel character, a character that they still are trying to get off the ground over at Marvel Studios. But this film took itself seriously, and Batman, you know, this is a far cry from what we got in the 1960s with Adam West. You know, it's in a campy version of Batman. Even the Tim Burton Batmans with Michael Keaton, as dark and moody as they were more, they still were more comic booky. They still had a little camp to it. Not as much as the Adam West Batman, of course, but it was still campy to a degree, but it was enjoyable. And it definitely is a far cry from what Joel Schumacher gave us in Batman Forever and, God forbid, Batman and Robin, where it, it was just 2 hour cartoons, you know, a live action adaptation of cartoons and toy commercials. That's what they were essentially. And this was a actual film. This wasn't a movie. This was a film. This was a Batman that we can see in the real world. They used real world locations. They used real world scenarios and whatnot. Yes. Is it based on a fictional character in a fictional world? Yes, it was. Is it a film that's asking you to suspend disbelief about a man dressing up as a bat and running around the city fighting crime? Yeah, but I mean, it's still, for the most part, grounded in reality. And it went on to spawn two sequels, a part of this Dark Knight trilogy that Christopher Nolan gave us. And all three of those films are deeply rooted in reality. There's no fantastical elements to it. We didn't see Superman pop up. We didn't see Green Lantern pop up. We didn't see Wonder Woman scoop in. And it was really a Batman story, and a story that I can believe actually can take place. You know what I'm saying? But with all that being said, before Christopher Nolan took the reins, we had a pitch from Darren Aronofsky, you know, who did Requiem for a Dream, and later on did Mother and Noah and Black Swan, and what's the other one? The Whale, with Brandon Fraser, that won him an Academy Award. He's done a lot of movies. I don't know how to describe his films. They're entertaining to a degree. They're very interesting, thought provoking films. And he was going to do a Batman. They actually went ahead with it. I think they greenlit it and was starting pre-production on it, if I'm not mistaken, on his version. It was going to be Batman Year One, and it was going to be an adaptation. This wasn't a clear, just beat for beat adaptation of the comic series, but it was going to be just elements of it. I think Batman was a homeless guy. He wasn't a billionaire. Lucius Fox was a mechanic that built the Batmobile for him out of a taxi cab or something. I don't forgot, but it was stooped in super realism. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, I want an element. Well, I wouldn't mind an element of realism in these films. This film, Batman Begins, is realistic to a degree, like I described before. But they found the happy medium. Christopher Nolan found the happy medium between the comic book world and realism, and gave us this, and gave us his complete trilogy of this. And for the most part, it was good. It was just too real. It probably would have been an interesting film. I'm talking about the Darren Aronofsky film that he was working on. I think it probably would have been a decent film, but just not a good Batman film. You know, if you got to change a character just completely, I mean, strip him down to his bones, it's not that character no more. You know, just make a different movie. It doesn't have to be a Batman film. But whatever. We didn't get that movie. This is what they settled on, and I'm all for them doing it, and the world is better for it, in my humble opinion. And so when Christopher Nolan came on board, he was hired to direct a Batman film, an unnamed Batman film. And he brought on David S. Goyer to write the screenplay. And David S. Goyer, I mentioned Blade earlier, he wrote all of the Blade films. You know, let's take away Blade Trinity, because he even directed that one. But those were horrible. But that one was horrible, I should say. But the first two Blades were great, especially that first one. Loved it. And he was the writer on those. He wrote a few comic book movies around that time, and he you know, early 2000s, late 90s, David S. Goyer was one of the top writers in Hollywood. So him coming on board to write this film was, I think, money. Smart move. And so the decision was made on doing an origin story of the character. We never got a true origin story of Batman. Uh, yeah, we touched in on him with Michael Keaton, but we never got a true story. He was already established as Batman around that time. And so, at least when the movie started. So we didn't get from infancy stage to him brooding on top of a building. And we just got him brooding on top of a building and in the opening scene. And so to get it exploration into this character and really dive into this character and what makes him tick, what brought him to this moment was an exciting aspect to me. And that's what really drew me into being just the most excited I've ever been for a comic book movie around this time. And now Christopher Nolan, he wanted a sweeping epic. He wanted something like Lawrence of Arabia type feel. And you could tell in some of those shots and some of the scenes that he really went for it here. And Christopher Nolan, if you look at his filmography, that's what he do. It doesn't matter if it's Batman or The Prestige or even Oppenheimer. He wants every element. He's such a detail-oriented director. It is phenomenal. I don't know how he does what he does. And me, always wanting to be a filmmaker, always wanting to be a director, I look at Christopher Nolan films, it really just deflate all the air out of my balloon of wanting to be a director, because there's no way I can make films like this. These are films that I love and that I inspire to make or have inspired to make, if I ever got the opportunity. And I see the movies he make and I'm like, there's no way, because my biggest dream is to make a Batman film. And I could never make a Batman film like this. Even with Matt Reeves and with the Batman, as simple of a concept that is a hard film to make. And those two directors pulled it off. But you really have to understand the character and love the character. As much as I love Michael Keaton's Batman and Tim Burton directing those films, you can tell Tim Burton knew nothing about Batman. And for the most part, neither did Michael Keaton, because he said this in interviews, which still to this day is mind-boggling to me. He had never, up to that point, never read any comic book, let alone a Batman comic book, when he was cast. But when he got in front of that camera, he got it. He knew the character. He knew that Batman is the personality. Bruce Wayne is the mask. And he knew that and executed it perfectly. Same thing here when they got to the casting, but we'll get to the casting in a second. But Nolan wanted a R-rated. He wanted to go really, really, real, gritty. He didn't want to hold anything back. This is where him and Warner Brothers differed. Warner Brothers left him alone for the most part in the production of Batman Begins, except for this one little note. It can't be R-rated because Batman is their moneymaker at Warner Brothers. It has always been since 1989. It's always been their movie. This is the one movie they cannot fumble. And you want to appeal to adults as well as children. And that's where they messed up with Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. They wanted to make it kid friendly, but they made it too kid friendly. And, trying to sell toys and whatnot. It was more of a merchandising thing. It wasn't a quality of film thing. But they wanted you can go hard PG-13, but you can't go R. You can't go soft R. And so Nolan, he didn't have a problem with this, but he wanted to make the film that he wanted to see when he was 11 years old. So he settled on the PG-13. One of the big inspirations for this film, as far as writing the screenplay and what they were basing it on, what source material, it wasn't just over the span of 80 years of comics that they went through. They went to one particular comic, and that was Batman: The Long Halloween, which is arguably one of the best comics you can read. If I'll When someone asks me, I've never read comics, I want to get into comics. I want to read a Batman comic in particular. Which one should I read? Because there's, like I said, 70, 80 years of Batman comics to read. Which one should I read? I said, well, I'll tell you, pick up The Long Halloween. The Long Halloween will, if that doesn't hook you, it is just not meant for you. This is the definitive Batman comic, in my humble opinion. This is the one that really dives into Batman's psyche and whatnot, and pushes him to limits that no other comic I can remember doing, And when I found out that this was going to be the inspiration for this film, once again, I'm hooked. I'm hooked in. A very good choice to dive into this world, reboot this franchise with that particular comic book. And Goyer, when he was writing the screenplay, he had the villain Carmine Falcone as one of the main elements, which was in also in The Long Halloween. So it all made sense, and he wanted to take a serious approach to the material. And so the writers considered having Harvey Dent in the film because, once again, that's a big part of that comic book. But they held off on that, and that's when they created this new character of Rachel Dawes, which acted somewhat of a substitute to the Harvey Dent character. David S. Goyer, he also he used a couple of other comic books as well as, templates, and had story elements that he wanted to incorporate into this film. Batman Dark Victory, which is a sequel, if you will, to The Long Halloween. I vaguely remember it. It doesn't stick with me like The Long Halloween, but I do kind of remember it. And we also use, well, I say we like I wrote it, but they also use Batman Year One, of course, being as though this was going to be an origin story, which is also a good comic to dive into if you never read the comics. And that was written by Frank Miller, and Frank Miller, I mean, The Dark Knight Returns. What more you need to say? That comic book series, or graphic novel, I should say, redefined comic books in the late 80s, and it just changed the way you looked at that character, because up to that point, it was the campy Adam West. Didn't really take the character seriously until we got to that. So he did Batman Year One, and man, it was, and I think it was after Dark Knight Returns that he did Year One. But once again, it just stapled the seriousness of that character. But anyways, the other big serious thing while writing this film that was probably going to be on the top of everybody's mind, and whenever you hear about a Batman movie coming out, the first thing that comes to your mind, it'll be the second, because the first thing is who's playing Batman, and the second thing is, well, who's going to be the villain. Everybody's automatic go-to is Joker. You go to Joker because that's his arch nemesis, that's his greatest foe, his deadliest foe, going head to head with Joker. Well, Christopher Nolan and David S. Goyer, they showed restraint. They did something that I thought was bold and pretty smart at the same time, and that is they settled on Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul as the villains of this film. And both of those characters have not appeared in any other live action Batman, including the Tim Burton films, the Joel Schumacher films. They didn't appear in the Adam West 1960s television show. These are characters that came after the fact. So they never appeared in live action. They were on the animated series, but never in live action. So getting these two characters in live action was an exciting new touch, a different route to go, because both of these characters aren't physical threats to Batman, more psychological. And so right off the bat, you knew that, no pun intended, right off the bat, you knew that this was going to be a different Batman film. This wasn't going to be all punchy, smash. This was going to be more psychological. And once again, if you know the Batman character, that's what he is. Yes, he can fight. He's the greatest fighter there is. He knows every style of fight you can fight. So I would love to see him in action, of course, and we get a little of that in the film. But it's more. It's more that we're dealing with these two characters in particular. So that also brought a level of excitement. A common idea in the comics is that Bruce saw Zorro, the film Zorro, with his parents before they were murdered. And Nolan explained in an interview that by ignoring that idea, which he stated is not found in Batman's first appearance in comics, it emphasizes the importance of bats to Bruce, and that becoming a superhero is a wholly original idea on his part. And so that taking that element out of it, like he was inspired by Zorro, and being inspired by his own fears, his own trauma to become this superhero, makes him even greater of a superhero, which is genius, I believe, by Christopher Nolan, taking that approach. And it is for this reason Nolan believes that no other DC characters exist in this universe that this film is set in. Otherwise, Bruce Wayne's reasons for taking up this costume vigilante would have been very different. It wouldn't have been as personal of a journey that he went on in these three films. And so, once again, great decision, to set this in its own little standalone universe. We didn't have to worry about Metropolis. We didn't have to worry about Star City and Barry Allen coming in to investigate something. Lex Luthor coming to work a merger with Bruce Wayne and Wayne Enterprises and all that. It is none of that. It was none of that. This was a separate thing. Now, what made it so genius, it could, you could have incorporated more superheroes into this universe easily. They kept it vague, it kept it open to whereas you could do it, but it didn't need it. You see how the MCU, and this is no disrespect to the MCU, but I'm saying, you see how the MCU has become over reliant on other superheroes, other characters in that universe in order for something to be successful. If you don't believe me, why do everybody stay at the end of the credits? Why everybody waits to the end of the credits? Because you want to see that post-credit scene. You want to see where this leads to next. Who's showing up next time? How is this going to link up to the overall universe? And I do it. We all enjoy it. That's why it's in a very successful franchise. I'm not mad at it, but I'm just comparing the two. The MCU relies on the entire universe, whereas this Dark Knight trilogy didn't. It only relied on one thing and one thing only, and that is Batman. So let's get into the casting of that character and all the other characters as well, but mainly on Bruce Wayne himself. And you had to nail this, of course. And I think Christopher Nolan kind of took the same approach that Richard Donner took in 1978 when he was casting for Superman, and getting a virtual unknown in Christopher Reeves. And Christopher Reeves was working around that time. I think he was on a soap opera. I think you ask my mom, she'll tell you. But he was working on small screen stuff. So casting a virtual unknown when they had major stars that Warner Brothers wanted for the role of Superman. You know, I think Clint Eastwood and Robert Redford and others. Paul Newman. I think it was a whole bunch of big name stars around that time that Warner Brothers wanted, but Richard Donner wanted this unknown, this something. You know, he wanted the character to be the star, not the star to be the star, and it was smart. And I think Christopher Nolan went that route here. Now, Christian Bale was no unknown by no stretch of the imagination in 2005. Christian Bale had, I want to think, what, it was like the 90s? Well, of course, it would have been the 90s, but I want to say late 80s. The first time I saw Christian Bale, and that was in that Steven Spielberg film. Oh man, why is the movie escaping my mind right now? Shucks, but it was a war film, but he was young, and he was in that stupid Disney musical, Newsies or something like that. And of course, everybody knew him from American Psycho. The dude was great, you know, but he was mostly known for playing villains, you know, i.e. American Psycho and Shaft with Samuel Jackson and in other films. But as Batman, it would have been weird. But before they settled on Christian Bale, they brought in a number of actors. I mean, buku actors. And some of these names, when you go through the list, you're like, oh man, oh man, oh man. Even though I love Christian Bale in the role, I think Christian Bale did a good job. Is he my favorite Batman? No, but I did like him as Bruce Wayne Batman. I thought he was great for these films. You know what I'm saying? But before Mr. Bale, we had a few contenders for the role. One in particular is one Mr. Henry Cavill. He was in contention, and of course, we all know he later became Superman for Zack Snyder and Man of Steel, which coincidentally was produced by Christopher Nolan. But at first, he went after the Bruce Wayne role for this film. Also in consideration, you had Billy Crudup, you had Hugh Doherty, Jake Gyllenhaal, who I thought would have been incredible as Bruce Wayne. I've been champion for him to be in a superhero film forever. I know that he was in Spider-Man Far From Home. He was Mysterio, but I wanted to see him as Batman, man, because I think Jake Gyllenhaal is a perfect Bruce Wayne Batman. But nonetheless, he didn't get it. Joshua Jackson lobbied for the role. David Boreanaz from Angel fame and Bones, he was in consideration at one point. Heath Ledger was in consideration. Heath Ledger, who just had to wait a couple of years, and he did end up in a Christopher Nolan directed Batman film, The Dark Knight, when he portrayed the Joker in that film and won an Academy Award nonetheless. Unfortunately, he passed away after, but yeah, he was in consideration. Another name that was very, very close to getting the role was Cillian Murphy. Cillian Murphy, who worked with Christopher Nolan on Oppenheimer and also got an Academy Award in 28 Days Later and so on and so forth. Peaky Blinders. Yes, he was in super consideration, super close, but didn't get the role. But he was so good in the role, at least in his audition, that he did get a role in the film to play Jonathan Kane, aka Scarecrow. So he did get a role, but it wasn't the role that he initially went after. Josh Hartnett, he was famously known. I think Christopher Nolan straight up offered him the role. He didn't have to audition or nothing. He straight up offered it to him, but Josh Hartnett turned it down. He didn't want to pursue it. He didn't want to be typecast. He was also in consideration at one point for Superman. I think it was for Superman Returns, with Bryan Singer directing, but he didn't want that either. He didn't want a superhero role. He's later said, recently when he's on his little kind of renaissance of his career, uh, he regrets those decisions, not taking those big roles. But I think he did. He fared out all right. But I would have liked to have seen him in those, you know, namely Superman. I think he would have been a good Superman. Batman, maybe. I'll have to see him in the cape and cowl to make that determination, but it's all good. I think they settled on somebody that really fit the role, that really jumped into it head first and did a phenomenal job, and that is Christian Bale. And Christian Bale, when they announced this right when the Machinics came out, and in that film, Christian Bale, he dives head first into roles. He doesn't cheapen the role at all. If he has to play an anorexic person, he's going to be anorexic. If he got to be a big boned person, a plump individual, he's going to be plump. He's not going to get the makeup and all that. He's going to do it. And for the Machinists, he had to lose like 100 pounds or something. He had lost a lot of weight and he was skin and bones. And so when they announced that, and you looking at him and you're like, he's gonna be Batman. Batman who? He was just small, but he put on 100 pounds. He hired a personal trainer. He put on 100 pounds of muscle, and he looked phenomenal physically. At least in that first film, he was good in the physically in the other films, but in Batman Begins, he was in phenomenal shape, and it just blew my mind how quick he put on this muscle before the role. But he did a phenomenal job. To round out the cast, you had Michael Caine as Alfred Pennyworth. You had Liam Neeson as Ra's al Ghul, Katie Holmes as Rachel Dawes, Gary Oldman as Jim Gordon, as I said before, Cillian Murphy as the Scarecrow, Morgan Freeman as Lucius Fox. It was just a stellar cast that they put together for this film. This film, I would consider probably the best origin story in comic book history, in live action wise. I thought this was phenomenal, and I didn't feel this way in 2005. Just to be fair and honest with you all, I liked the movie. I enjoyed the movie back then, but I did not feel like it was just this I don't know, masterpiece of film until maybe after The Dark Knight. And I grew a greater appreciation of it. Actually, it was after Dark Knight Rises, because Dark Knight Rises is the weaker of these three films. And when I watched them all again, all three back to back to back, I grew a greater appreciation for Batman Begins, because unlike the last two films, it wasn't reliant on the villain. It wasn't relied on Joker, and it wasn't relying on Bane. It was relying on the story of Batman, or the origin story of Batman. Unlike the previous or the next two films in the franchise that posed a bigger threat to Gotham, even though in this film it does, but it was more of a to stop the threat against Gotham, whereas in Batman Begins, it was more of a one-on-one with Batman and Ra's al Ghul or Scarecrow, even though Ra's al Ghul's and Scarecrow's grand scheme was to poison Gotham. But their first objective was to get rid of the Batman. And so it was a clear focus on Batman, as opposed of the other two films. Now Joker was Joker in The Dark Knight, yeah, he was trying to mess with Batman, but it was more of him messing with Gotham City as a whole. It wasn't real. Batman was just one of the names on his list, should I say. And Bane just wanted to, he wanted the world to feel his pain, more or less. Batman was just a cog in the wheel, if you will. This film, Batman Begins, was more of a personal journey of Batman, of Bruce Wayne, and not Gotham. And that's why I feel this is the better of the three films. Yes, I'm including The Dark Knight, which was excellent film, but this was more excellent in my humble opinion. And it's slept on. It's not talked about as being one of those films, in the upper echelons of comic book movies that has come out over the past 20 years. I think it deserves its flowers as being the most influential film, or at least one of the most influential films of the last 2 decades. Just to go over the cast, as I went over a little bit, and all I can add is this was perfectly cast. Nobody was miscast except for one person, and that was Katie Holmes. Katie Holmes is the one that sticks out to me. And I say that because we later get a different version of this character in the second film, from Maggie Gyllenhaal. But in this particular film, and I always said, just to pause there for a second, it would have been awkward if Jake Gyllenhaal would have got cast as Bruce Wayne, and in The Dark Knight, his sister would have been cast as Rachel Dawes. I think that would have been a little awkward. But anyways, that never would have happened. But it was always funny to me that Rachel Dawes was played by Maggie Gyllenhaal after her brother was almost cast as Batman. But anyways, Katie Holmes just did not work for me. And it's just, I don't know. I never really faulted the film for it. Well, let me say it differently. I do fault the film for it because they put it in the film, but it's not a character it's in any comic book. This was created for the movie. And so it's hard to judge it. They're like, well, that character isn't like that in the comics. That's not a character from the comics. So you really can't judge it. But I'm not a Katie Holmes fan. She's bland to me. She's bland in everything. And I just don't. She just doesn't connect with me as an actress. Sorry, I just can't get on board with it. And she didn't work in this movie, whereas everybody else did. Everybody else was on the top of Everest, and she was somewhere in the valley. She was CW, and I know she comes from that ilk. She was on what show that was it, One Tree Hill or something like that. She was a CW actress, and it feels like she was on a CW show. She just did not work in this movie, and that's the only thing that didn't work in this movie. Now, is it criminally bad? No, it's not. But it's just, I don't know. Didn't like the performance. One of the most unique things about this movie that stands out a lot, that once again nobody talks about, is the score. And this score was given to us by the great Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard. Now, these are two different composers, and they're working on this one film. And for a while, I was wondering why, because these are two different styles. They do two different things. And it wasn't until I watched the film twice. This is how slow I am as a human being mentally. It took two viewings for me to realize why there are two different composers on this film. One did the score for Bruce Wayne, and one did the score for Batman. And I always noticed that there was a different tone in the score, that was kind of different, but yet it was blended. But it, it was uniquely done. And I thought it was genius. I never disliked it. But I just thought it was weird that you had these two different composers. And after the second viewing, while I was watching it, it clicked. It was like, dummy. One's doing Batman's theme and the other one's doing Bruce Wayne's theme. Now, in later iterations, in Dark Knight and in Dark Knight Rises, I think James Newton Howard didn't return. It was all Hans Zimmer after that. But for this, it was these two composers, and I thought it was once again genius. This Christopher Nolan just doing him, man, and coming up with this idea to use two different composers for this one character who is actually two characters, and it helped reinforce the fact that these are two different personalities. These are two different people living in the same body. And I mean, how can you not be impressed with that level of dedication and detail to a comic book movie? Once again, we never, and you can make an argument, we still haven't gotten that level of detail. Maybe Black Panther, but even then, I don't think it really spent that much detail to it, as much as you got it in Batman Begins, to explore this comic book character that is quote unquote made for kids or whatever the case may be. But it is genius. I thought it was genius, and this movie is genius. I love the reveal that Liam Neeson is Ra's al Ghul. We got that fake out in the beginning with Ken what's it Watanabe, who portrayed the decoy Ra's al Ghul with the Fu Manchu and everything. You thought that Liam Neeson was going to be just a guy that's in the lead of shadows and whatnot, but it come to find out he's actually Ra's al Ghul, and I thought that was genius. Even though, for those who are cunning, you figured it out pretty quickly, but for the layman, it was a nice twist. They even had the audacity to put a twist in here. Gary Oldman, who does no wrong in my eyes, film wise, perfectly cast as Jim Gordon. The Batmobile, the Tumbler, I thought was really nice. I it's arguably it's probably my best, or not my best, but my favorite Batmobile. Now I loved Robert Pattinson's because it was simple. It was homemade. You know what I'm saying? It's something that that I wish I could drive. That's one of the more believable ones that I think I can drive that one. I can't drive the Tumbler. I couldn't drive Michael Keaton's. I definitely couldn't drive Val Kilmer's or George Clooney's Batmobiles. But this one was like a tank. It was a tank. The roar of those engines. It was just beautiful, man. That's why I love Robert Pattinson. The sound of it was just phenomenal. It was like a beast, a monster within its own right. And the Tumbler was also amazing. I like the suit here. A little robotic in the movement. It because of the way it restricts Christian Bale, but it was a nice suit. It's hard to nail down a Batman suit. The only one that actually looked good in live action, honestly, in my humble opinion, was Ben Affleck's in Batman v Superman. Even though the movie leaves a lot to be desired, but I love the suit. I love that suit. This suit, it was decent. It was all right. It got better as the films went along. When he got different versions of the suit in The Dark Knight and then Dark Knight Rises. But this suit, it just looked way too bulky. And I don't know. It was just like, man, how is he even moving in that suit? But it worked for the most part. And the only flaw I have other than the Katie Holmes casting is the fight choreography here. And you may ask yourself, what fight choreography? Exactly. You couldn't see the fights. You couldn't. The way they were editing and cutting around it, and I think it's because of that suit. I think because Christian Bale couldn't move like he wanted to move in that suit, and it restricted a lot of movement and fluidity of that character, and they just edited around it, and it suffered, man. That movie suffered for that, because that was the only element of the film where I was solely disappointed. I wasn't disappointed in Katie Holmes because I knew what I was going to get with Katie Holmes, but I was disappointed because I wanted to see Batman just wreak havoc, fight wise. And I, before that movie came out, you remember when HBO did these first looks? I don't know if they still do them or not. At least I haven't noticed it, but they used to do first looks, and they did one on this, and they had a whole section where they talked about the fight choreography, and I'm watching the guy, the fight choreographer, do set up the fighting, the blocking for the fights and all this other stuff. I'm like, man, this is gonna be, phenomenal, because he was like, yeah, we're introducing a new fight style and this, that, and the third. I'm like, oh man, this is gonna be fire. UFC in a comic book movie, and didn't get to see nothing. We got to the movie, we didn't see it. Man, what a let! I was so hurt by that. But I learned to just get over it. It kind of added to the mysticism of Batman. It's kind of like in Jaws. Like, for 80% of that movie, you don't see the shark, but you know what the shark doing. The shark is lurking, and the shark is causing damage and killing people, but you never see the shark. And I started looking at it from that aspect of Batman. You never see Batman, but you see the aftermath, and you see the results of it and whatnot. And that's how I looked at it, and that's how I grew to accept it. But I was disappointed because I wanted to actually see it. I guess the same way people wanted to see the shark in Jaws. And Steven Spielberg intended you to see it, but the shark kept malfunctioning on set. But that's neither here nor there. Batman Begins, 20 years, and it still holds up perfectly as one of the best Batman films of all time, one of the best comic book adaptations of all time, and one of the best origin stories adapted onto screen. This movie was made for $150 million. That was the budget for Batman Begins, and that's the norm now. But back 20 years ago, that was a big budget. They rolled the dice on this movie, and it paid off because it ended up grossing $373.7 million worldwide, making it a hit and spawning a sequel. Two sequels, I might add: The Dark Knight, which came out in 2008, and The Dark Knight Rises, which came out in 2012. This is a phenomenal film from a phenomenal filmmaker with a phenomenal cast to add. Batman Begins gets a letter grade of an A-. I love this movie, man. I really do. And I think it needs to be talked about on how influential this movie is, how important this movie is when you going off to see Superman in a couple of weeks, when you go to see Fantastic Four in a couple of weeks, when you watch Avengers Endgame and Doomsday coming down the line, and all these great comic book movies that we have been peppered with over the last 20 years. You need to bow down and acknowledge Batman Begins, because without this movie, I don't think we get any of those films, because this made Hollywood, this made the critics, this made the audience realize that you can make an excellent comic book film that appeals to everybody, not just the geeks and the nerds like me who will accept anything up to that point. But this movie made you not accept mediocrity no more, because after this there was no mediocre comic book movies that people just took and ran with. That's not to say that we didn't get mediocre films after this. We got them, but people were more vocal about their displeasures with those films, and not only spoke about it online, but they spoke about it with their wallets too. And so Batman Begins, thank you for taking this genre seriously and giving us such an excellent comic book film. 20 years and you haven't aged a day. But I would love to know, what are your thoughts on Batman Begins? Did you enjoy it? What was your favorite out of the three? Was it Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, Dark Knight Rises? I know a lot of people are going to say The Dark Knight, and I'm not going to fight you on that. I get it. You know, it is an excellent film as well. But I just enjoyed this one more. You know, when I went back to rewatch, I just enjoyed this so much, especially being a big Batman fan myself. But I want to know your thoughts. Email the show, kbradiopodcast@gmail.com. You can also search for the show on all social media platforms. Just search for the KB Radio Network. Also, don't forget about the YouTube channel. Subscribe to the KB Radio Network channel and like this video if you don't mind. Don't forget about the 5 stars, the reviews, and sharing this show if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you are currently listening to Movie Goodness here on the KB Radio Network. Everybody, thank you for joining me as we celebrated the 20th year anniversary of Batman Begins. Want you all to know that I love you, continue to love everyone, and until we speak again, you all be blessed.